Hello, all, and welcome to the Relationship Renovation Podcast. I'm Tara Kerwin.
And my name is EJ Kerwin. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about the concept of shame. And we're going to look into how shame affects individuals, how it affects couples. We're going to sort of define what shame is. We're going to talk about shame versus guilt. We're going to explore why we feel shame, what its purpose is, and what are some common triggers to shame? And then in particular, we're going to explore how shame impacts the LGBTQIA plus community. And on that note, we're going to have Tara introduce who our special guest to help us explore this subject is today.
I was laughing because I was going to say, can you say shame one more time?
Shame, shame, shame.
We are very excited and grateful to actually have one of our own clinicians, Mr. Kelby Jones, here with us in our studio because his specialty is shame and how it impacts individuals, couples, and also the LGBTQ plus IA community. And so, yes, let me introduce Mr. Kelby Jones, licensed associate counselor, amazing couples therapist here at Relationship Renovation. And I could go on forever, but I know that I can't. So welcome, Kelby.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be on the show today.
Yeah. Hey, so Kelby, I mean, one of the best things right at the beginning is help people get to know you. And you have a really interesting background as sort of what brought you into this field. Tell us about yourself a little bit.
Yeah, so, I grew up in Arkansas, small town. I think 300 people was the last time I saw the population sign.
That is amazing.
Yeah. So growing up, I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew that I wanted to do film and TV and probably get out of that small town. So my undergrad is in film and television production. I lived in New Orleans. I've worked, all over, just doing different productions and stuff, and kind of got siloed into reality TV. So, a lot of interesting topics to be explored there.
Yeah.
But it just ultimately wasn't as fulfilling for me personally. So I left that industry and was doing kind of some random things here and there, and kind of decided to go back and get my master's in counseling. And that's how I kind of came to this.
Yeah. I similar to you, had like a background in another field, similar to you as well, in media entertainment. And there was a transition for me between that field and wellness and mental health that I found actually they weren't that far apart. I mean, can you maybe just tell us a little bit, like, what was that gap for you that got you from media to this?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things I learned going into my master's program was about what we call attending skills and, being a therapist. And I kind of realized that, a lot of the attending skills and motivational interviewing skills that we practice as therapists, I was already doing when I was working in reality TV. Mm-hmm. And I just kind of had this realization for me that we were taking these stories, these very, real human stories, and we were perverting them and passing them through a filter and then putting them out on national television for exploitation. Mm. And I just didn't want to be a part of that game anymore. So I wanted to use those skills and what I had kind of identified early on as a talent of mine to do some good in the world. And, I thought that was the direction I was going to go, but I just kind of realized that wasn't it when I was in TV. So
how are you liking this journey so far in the mental health, couples counseling, individual counseling realm?
I absolutely love it. I've felt very blessed. I remember being in, kind of in a place, and I was just asking myself, if all of my needs were met financially, and all of that, what would I still be doing every day? And I guess I've been a therapist kind of my whole life, just unofficially. And so I knew I was going to be doing this every day, and I loved it. And if I could get paid at it, great. So that's kind of how I approached it. And it has been reinforced over and over and over every day, every session. This is what I'm supposed to be doing, and I'm very happy.
Well, and it just comes across in our supervisions and our group supervisions and just from client feedback that you're just a very gifted, skillful therapist. So your journey was, your intuition to follow this path was right on.
And when we asked you, like, hey, please come onto the podcast, please talk about something, and we wanted it to be something that you really connected with, something that you have, a lot of insight into. It seemed like shame was something that automatically popped up for you. Like, why is that?
So as I mentioned earlier, I grew up in a really small town in a pretty conservative area. And I'm in a same-sex relationship, I'm gay. And, it was something that for me was affecting my life in a lot of different ways, and specifically in my purpose and, where I felt the most valuable. And as I was trying to reconcile a lot of that for myself, I kind of came across Brene Brown's work, and, she's very fundamental in talking about shame. And it just completely transformed my life. And I knew that this was the type of work I wanted to get into because I saw so much of this showing up in my own community. And not just in the LGBT community, but also, in couples that I see on a regular basis. I mean, I can almost relate anything back to the shame that we feel. So for me, shame was underpinning so much of what I was experiencing growing up and so much of what I see in other people's lives.
There's certain words that when I bring them up in a session with an individual or a couple, that people sort of shrink away from, or they shake their heads, or they don't want to link into it. Resentment's one that people sort of quickly push away. Shame is almost heavier, right? And so maybe it might be nice to start this conversation with help us understand the way you conceptualize shame. What is shame?
It's funny because Brene Brown has a joke that she tells when she doesn't want to talk to people on the plane, and they ask her what she does. She says, "Oh, I'm a shame researcher," and people pretty much shut down because they don't want to talk about it. Shame, as she defines and in her research, shame is just simply the fear of disconnection. And so the way that I conceptualize that is that we do have this fear that there's something about us or something that we've done that is going to disconnect us from our family, from our community, from our tribe, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so, shame is really difficult to talk about because shame thrives on secrecy. And the more that, we talk about it, in fact, the more that it heals. Mm-hmm. And so shame doesn't like that. And so the way that it shows up is to not talk about it.
Yeah, I did a training years ago around sexual addiction, and the differentiation that they made between shame and guilt, I thought was really powerful. Was that guilt is I feel bad about something I did, whereas shame is I feel bad about who I am.
I am bad.
Yeah,
yeah, exactly, and. Guilt is a focus on the actions. When we take something that we've done, an action that we've done that we don't feel proud of, and we make that part of our identity, then what happens is it's really difficult to heal from something that we've made part of our identity. Shame, as you said, I am bad. Guilt, I did something bad. And so if, say, my partner and I, we had a date planned, and I couldn't get away from work, or, I was late or something happened and I missed the date, or I, was late and it was important, and I could tell that really affected him. There's kind of a choice. It might be an unconscious choice, but there's kind of a choice there of I can feel guilty for this. I can feel guilt for doing something, showing up late or missing this date. And in that, there's already a path to resolution, because in that guilt, I know, okay, well, next time I'm going to, show up. I'm going to be more dependable. Mm-hmm. If we allow this to turn to shame, that looks like I'm a bad partner. I'm undependable. That's really hard to kind of come back from.
Yeah. Well, and I think when we are talking about shame and how a lot of people resist going there, and I don't think a lot of people, individuals or partners in relationships understand the driving force that shame creates to feeling disconnected. Yeah. And so we have to talk about it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, what I heard you say, and you reinforce that there, Tara, is that guilt is transient. It's associated with an action, and it's a lot more easily resolved. Whereas shame becomes foundational sometimes for an individual, and it sort of becomes a blanket that they wear, all the time. So how do you look at, like, when you meet with an individual, when you meet with a couple, like, what are the first signs to you that shame is having an impact upon them?
I listen for two phrases, but the biggest one I listen to in terms of shame is I'm listening for anything that starts with I am. Of course, if it's following with something that's, positive, I wouldn't label that as shame. But if they're talking about, I am a bad partner or I am stupid, I hear these things a lot when people talk about, even on an individual level. That's a big indicator that person, that there's a core belief there. That's a shame statement. There's a core belief that's backing that up. And the other one, and this is probably for a different talk, but is I should. And that usually leads to some sort of expectation. And my next question is this realistic or unrealistic for that person? But again, that goes to a different talk.
And my question too is because, again, this is a sensitive topic. A lot of people don't want to go there. Like, what do you notice about in the therapeutic process when you're starting to kind of notice and address shame? Like, how do you get people to open up about it? How do you get your clients to open up about it?
So, when I start seeing shame come up in sessions with couples, one of the first things that I start to do is create a safe space. Because what I know is that shame, the response that we have to it, the shutdown that you're talking about, the avoidance of talking about it, that is essentially a trauma response, because shame is very associated with trauma. And so what I start to do in that moment is I'm falling back on my skills as a clinician to create this safe space and safe environment, to, remove any perceptions of judgment, just kind of working to normalize what they're going through, the emotions they're going through.
Yeah, that safe space seems like incredibly important, right? Because what I've experienced is that when there is shame involved, an individual has created a lot of barriers around it. They've kept it socked pretty deep inside of them, which makes it hard to access. And then by the time they're coming to see you as an individual client, or you in the context of couples counseling, it's pretty well insulated, and it's started to cause a lot of disruptions in their life. And establishing a place where we can talk about that thing that you've got hidden deep inside of yourself is like essential to even have a chance for them to address it.
And I was going to say, I think shame keeps a lot of people away from therapy. To me, that looks like that resistance piece that definitely, I've known a lot of people who just don't want to go there because they're afraid of what would happen, right? And also that I think when people come to therapy, or they have this idea of therapy, it's like, oh, there's something wrong with me. But really, you're just in this setting with a skilled professional who's providing unconditional, positive regard and safety. And you can be anything you need to be. And it's freaking amazing because you are held in this safe space. And how often do we get to be held in a safe space outside of a therapist office? It might take a minute to feel comfortable and get used to it, but that's right? Because you said the way to reduce and heal shame is by talking about it.
And that's one of the things that I do with couples specifically is we'll talk about, what about this space, meaning the therapeutic space, the office, what about this experience made it possible for you to talk about this today? And they'll usually talk about, oh, well, I didn't feel judged. I didn't feel shamed. I felt comfortable. I felt like I could do that. And then I'll ask them some questions, well, how did you know that you weren't going to be judged? What were the things, getting them to identify what constitutes a safe space. And then I say, how can you create this at home and in your relationship? Yeah. Because this is where this comes up, is oftentimes, you were talking about it getting deeply embedded. I think of that as like the scar tissue. If we look at this, say, take yourself back to when you were a little kid and maybe you fell off the monkey bars and you broke your arm. And, at that time in our lives, and especially with something like breaking a bone, you're going to go to the doctor, you get a cast. Everybody at school wants to sign it. It's almost like this rite of passage, right?
Right.
Emotional trauma, shame included, it's not like that. We don't look at it that way. One, you can't get a cast and people can't sign that. But even if you could, people don't want to know about it. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to know about it. And so what happens is we start to lock that away. We start to hide it. And if we treated that broken bone the same way that we treat mental health issues, what would happen is after years, that bone would heal crooked. That bone would be, painful maybe. You might have a lot of residual effects. And when you finally go to the doctor to get that fixed, they're going to have to re-break that and reset it. Shame work is much like that. We've locked this away. It's healed in ways that it's showing up in our lives in ways that we're not in control of. And so in order to heal it, we have to really dive deep. And that might look like getting through some scar tissue, and that can be painful, and we have to take that slow.
Thank you for that metaphor, comparison visual, because that really made sense to me.
When you said residual effects, and then you said, I forget what the other phrase was, but you mentioned just the way it's affecting them in their lives. Like, so if there's an individual at home and they're listening to this and they're like, wow, like, do I carry shame, and is it impacting myself, my relationships? What are those residual effects that both of you that you see when somebody is carrying this?
I see it in how they talk to themselves. It's really subtle. It goes back to, they're telling me of an experience that they had, and then they drop in and I'm stupid. So there's this, or I'm not I'm not worthy. And the residuals that I see going through your life is these are core beliefs. And so core beliefs basically are statements about yourself or the world that influence how you show up. And so if I have a core belief or a shame statement that says I'm unworthy, and I go into, say, a workspace or into a relationship, and that person or that work environment is saying, no, you're a very valuable employee. We really enjoy you. One, I'm probably not going to believe that because I don't believe it myself.
It doesn't match your belief filters of the world and yourself. Yeah.
Exactly. And then what happens in relationships, which I think might even be a little bit more insidious, is we start to then say, well, what's wrong with you that you would believe something like that about me? Because I know that's not true. You must have ulterior motives, or you must be, trying to pull one over on me or use me, And so that comes up a lot in relationships too.
I see the mistrust piece and also like that undeserving piece. And then I feel like some people who do carry shame do a lot of people pleasing and caretaking of others and not themselves because they don't see their needs or wants as important. And then unfortunately, it creates this very dysfunctional dynamic of codependency.
Sure. Well, and it also, because you've built a barrier around this portion of yourself that's extremely vulnerable, that you don't want anybody to access, it also puts like sort of a limit on how deeply you can connect with your partner.
Right.
And then your partner, at a certain point, they don't really totally understand what's going on, but they're like, why can't you break through to a deeper level? Like, why can't we connect more deeply in an intimate way? Why can't you show up in an emotionally open way? And then the partner gets really frustrated with it. What's wrong with you? Which then reinforces to the person who experiences the shame, like, yeah, you see, like, I'm just messed up. I'm just, I'm broken. I can't be fixed.
That's like the self-fulfilling prophecy of shame, yes.
Yeah. And it's a very pathogenic approach to it. What's wrong with me? Which is, when we think about pathogenic approaches, we're assuming that there was something wrong with you from the start. And so then we have the alternative approach, which is salutogenic, which basically is what happened to me? What happened to you? And so when we can approach it with that salutogenic approach and we say, what happened to you that you believe this way? Then we, again, much like with guilt versus shame, that becomes a focus on what we can do to change it.
Yes.
Whereas with pathogenic approach, we have to it's almost like acceptance versus resignation. We resign to this idea that there's something inherently wrong with us.
I feel like that's why when we're going through, with every individual and couple we see, we go through their genogram, which means their like kind of family history, their lifeline, their timeline, their life history, who they were from infancy to where they're at now. And it feels like being able to get that life story and really understand early attachment and internalized beliefs, that kind of starts the process of people like really seeing their life in a different way instead of, because normally we avoid, we withdraw, we will do anything to like ignore the step. But when we're looking at we're having to reflect on our entire lifeline, it starts to make sense a little, like maybe feels more comfortable, because that process is where a lot of our individuals in couples start to really increase compassion for themselves. Because I think they get to start thinking like, holy God, yes, maybe it's not just me.
Mm-hmm.
And to the partner, if it is in a coupleship, like, oh my God, there's other things outside of me that have caused you pain.
Mm-hmm.
I am not like the worst person in the world.
And I think you said a key word when you said compassion, because compassion is really the antidote to shame. You know, Tara, you introduced to us the intervention the other day in our meeting on polyvagal theory, which is essentially our fight or flight response. And, you know, EJ, you touched on it earlier when you were talking about, you know, feeling frustrated, or why is it so difficult for that individual to go deep? You know, what's that barrier that comes up? And that's our fight or flight response, or fawn or freeze, depending on how, you know, intense the experience is. And so what happens is, you know, we get to this place where this starts to become too painful for us to, you know, to address, to talk about, to re-experience. And I think that's one of the common misconceptions in trauma work, is that we have to re-experience or go through the nitty-gritty details of trauma in order to heal the shame that follows. And the truth is we don't. Yeah. We don't have to go through those details. In fact, you know, we really risk re-traumatization when we do try to take our clients through those details. Mm-hmm. And as a clinician, I ask myself often throughout the session, am I asking this question because I think that there's clinical value in terms of the work we're doing, or am I asking this question because I'm just being nosy? And if I can't justify a clinical reason, then the answer is I'm just being nosy, and I'm not going to ask that question.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. And I think that's also a huge barrier for people really doing the work that needs to be done around shame, is that they have this innate understanding of where it came from, and they have no interest whatsoever or no instinctive like sort of movement towards talking about that incident. And I know that I've done a lot of wonderful work with people around this and never gotten into that, but definitely got into what were the adaptive ways that you survived afterwards for 1 year, 5 year, 20 years that now have become maladaptive.
Yeah. How did you protect yourself then that is not working now? Now it's more dangerous because you're isolating yourself from people that love you and care about you and that you love.
Yeah. And I would say, you know, behaviors, focusing on behaviors have consequences. But I don't necessarily think that emotions have consequences. I think they're pretty neutral in that realm. It's how we respond to those emotions that end up having consequences, and those consequences can be good and bad. You know, we think about the bad ones being obviously disconnection in our partnership, or, you know, showing up in a way that is, you know, hurtful to our partner. You know, one thing to understand too is that one way that we kind of try to self-heal is by discharging that shame onto others. And again, when we're not willing to look at this and find a path to compassion for ourselves, we try to heal by discharging it onto others. And that's why you see so much of these shame cycles being repeated throughout the lifespan.
So help us understand that, discharging your shame onto others, because I think that would be a very important thing for a partner of somebody who really struggles with shame, but also the individual. Like, what does that look like?
So Brene Brown talks a little bit about this in her work, but really, you know, one of the things she says is, if you want to find where you feel shame the most, look at where you judge others. And the reason for that is, and what she says is this, the statement that we are saying when we, you know, maybe we see somebody and they're like, oh, I wouldn't wear those pants if I were her. That judgment we feel, what that really speaks to, and what we're really telling ourselves in that moment is, you know, I may look this way, but at least I don't look like that. You know, and so we'll discharge that shame off onto others as a form of judgment. And in fact, she says, if you're struggling to find where you feel the most shame, look at where you judge others the most. That's usually a good starting point. The way that this often will come up in couples work, you know, in terms of, you know, judgment of our partners and how that might relate back to shame that we feel inherently in ourselves, For example, if, you yourself are feeling that your body or the way that you eat or your health or any of that is an issue and you want to start working on that, but then you see your partner not taking that same approach or that same initiative and feeling like, well, they need, don't eat that. That's unhealthy for you. You're going to gain weight, and that judgment that they may have for that partner really is speaking to this deeper level of I myself am feeling shame about how I'm eating and what it is that I'm doing. And you mentioned earlier in the podcast, one of the big things that come up that shut people down is resentment. Resentment's also really attached to this. Brene Brown talks about resentment being kind of the crossroads between envy and anger. I'm so envious of you that now I'm mad about it. I'm so envious that you get to kind of eat whatever you want and it doesn't affect your physical, health, that now I'm angry about it. And so resentment and judgment, these are the things that are all, derived from the shame that we feel about ourselves that we can be projecting off into our partners.
And protecting from having to go in and take a deep look at the aspects of yourself that you don't accept, that you don't like, that you can't come to some sort of, compromise with and integrate, right?
Yeah.
To me, it's like that feeling of like, I don't have control, but I don't know how to be with that, right? I don't know how to be with that feeling of like, I'm not in control. So I'm going to discharge that, project that onto my environment. Maybe I need the cleanest house ever. Maybe I need EJ to look a certain way. Maybe I need to look a certain way. Maybe I need to present myself like this. But then once you start to really process what that really is, that's where you go into the shame of, I have no control, something bad is happening, or I'm a bad person. And then everything starts to kind of transition and shift. And I guess I'm kind of going now towards the healing piece. So I didn't mean to like move forward.
No, that was perfect.
I was going to say, you know what control is, right? Control is what we tell ourselves is the antidote to our anxiety. If I can control every aspect of this situation, then I can predict the outcome. And therefore, I don't have this fear of the future, which is what we would define as anxiety. And so we often will try to fight for control in our environment, but we also can pull back and look at that and say, well, we never really have control anyway. And so what we end up is there's this attempt to resolve this emotion that we feel through a behavior that we can look at and say, this isn't actually effective, but we trick ourselves into believing that it will be. And so what happens with that is we try to control everything. We try to control our environment. We try to control our partner. Again, we do that in an effort to ease our own anxiety. But anxiety is really more eased by predictability. If I have a routine, that routine increases predictability. That predictability reduces anxiety. Shame is one of those things that when I start talking about it and I talk about it as a fear response or a threat response, people, ask, well, how is that? Is that a stretch? And I think about it from the perspective of imagine yourself, the three of us are on an island and I have a certain amount of skills and EJ has a certain amount of skills and Tara has certain skills and together we have all of those skills. But if you guys decided to vote me off the island, i.e. reject me from your tribe, your group, your family, I now have only a third of the skills left to survive, a third of the resources, a third of the skills. So evolutionarily speaking, this very much does speak to our own survival instinct. And so it makes total sense why your amygdala would process shame and that fear of disconnection as a threat response and sound that response in the rest of your body. And so understanding that that's what's going on, and that part of the path to resolution for some of this is doing your own self-soothing work around, hey, we don't live on an island. I don't need to fit in with this group.
Yeah, and what jumped out to me are a couple things is one, in an effort to protect ourselves from our partner, the world around us, and keep that shame like buried deeply inside of us, we end up then letting our shame run the show.
Yep.
And then that's where, also when you were talking, I was just thinking about, well, that's also why shame is intergenerational, is just because if shame's been running the show for our parents and then for our parents' parents, of course, then it's going to run the show for us.
Yeah. And I think about it like taking chocolate pudding and putting that inside of a cardboard box and sticking that up in your pantry. it might hold for a little bit, but that cardboard's not going to last very long, and it's going to start to seep out and it will make a mess. And that's exactly what happens with shame is we try to put it in a box and put it away, but it seeps out into our lives and makes messes.
And then the pathway out of shame
Yeah.
is connection, right?
Mhm.
Is opening up, is finding, as we talked about at the very beginning, finding that safe space where you can start to talk about these are the things internally I struggle about myself.
Mhm. And, the intergenerational shame that you were talking about and kind of that, again, going back to how we tend to try to deal with our shame is to dispel it onto others. Well, if our parents are growing up with a certain amount of shame about something, then that's also what they're dispelling that off onto us. If there's shame about socioeconomic status or looks or, you think about
Sexuality and
sexuality, definitely as we talk about the LGBT community, these are things that, our parents are feeling shame for that they're dispelling off onto others. And for the parents out there, I know that it's not intentional, and I think that's part of that healing is understanding that, this is not intentional. It's just, the Buddhist principle of suffering of the human condition is one of suffering and the attempt to ease suffering. And we just have a really bad way of trying to ease this suffering by dispelling it onto others.
well, and even just societal shame, cultural shame, religious shame. We could go on and on.
Yeah, we could.
We just have so many messages in there like, you can't do this and you have to be like this and
Well, and you might come out of a family structure. You might be in a relationship. You might be in a community where it's absolutely not safe, where if you open up, it won't be accepted. It will be used against you because of their shame. And so why we do what we do, why you ended up doing this, why Tara and I have created what we created is like, we need to create safe spaces where people are unconditionally accepted for who they are, not necessarily their actions. Some of their actions might need help, right? But at the end of the day, like a place where you are a wonderful, beautiful human being.
Yes.
And we'll accept the mistakes you make. So let's get an understanding of what that shame is sort of like pushing you towards on a daily basis that just isn't working for you.
Yeah, because compassion and forgiveness are not acts of complacency. And in fact, we can, if we're doing it right, we are holding people accountable for their behaviors. And so understanding that behaviors are symptoms, but they're symptoms of what we're feeling.
So when you're starting to, when you're processing shame, when you're healing shame with a couple or with an individual, what do you notice when it starts to change?
One of the biggest things I notice is like you were saying, EJ, that, we need to create these safe spaces for each other to just exist exactly as we are. And what I start noticing when couples are starting to, do work around shame is that they start creating those spaces for themselves and for each other. And that just takes me right back to a lot of what the LGBT community is attempting to do for members of, we talk about pride events and we talk about different, safe spaces in terms of, community spaces and things like that. One of the things that, I've experienced is that you can come from the most loving and accepting family and you're still going to be taught that who you are is shameful because of how our society views that. And we can't deny that, everything we know about shame and relationships, we can't deny that, collective trauma in the LGBT community is not showing up in our relationships, and how we form connections. And mind you, when I talk about connection and relationships, I'm not talking about even just on the romantic sense. I'm talking about in our friendships, in our workplaces, in our families. You can come from a very loving and accepting environment and still learn that who you are is, not okay, right? And society will teach you that. And so for parents out there, because I do work with a lot of parents who have children, who are identifying as LGBT, they, that's what they don't always understand. It's they say, well, we've never taught them to be ashamed of that. We've never, it's always been accepted in our house. And we have to understand that whether you're gay or not, we all have things we have to quote unquote come out about. And it doesn't matter if your family is totally supportive of who you are as an individual, there's still a moment there where we have to question, is it going to be okay if I come out as this,
As who I am.
as who I am, and that's different than what my family believes me to be. And so that creates an inherent shame. Is there this fear of disconnection from my family, from my group, for who I am?
Mm-hmm.
And so that shame then, if we're not careful, begins to grow. If we don't talk about it, if we keep it in secret, and we don't have compassion for it.
I mean, sometimes the most powerful sharing we do on this show is the way we relate to a topic, because it humanizes it for people. And I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to just, here towards the end, just share a little bit about your journey through shame and how you noticed it and what's worked for you and what that has led to in your own life.
Yeah, I mean, we could have a whole episode
I was
on
going to say,
that.
that's
but,
a whole podcast,
yeah.
DJ.
But I can, the succinct version of it is this. I did grow up in an environment and in a family where it wasn't accepted, and it was something that was talked about in a negative sense. And I love my parents, and it's not about that. In fact, part of my own healing from that shame was finding compassion for what they were going through and understanding that, my dad grew up in a time where the AIDS epidemic was rampant and they weren't talking about it. And it was years before the president of the United States would even mention the words AIDS and acknowledge that it existed. And so, he grew up in a time where he was seeing people die of this on a regular basis and associating that with the quote unquote gay disease. That's where his fear came from.
Right.
And that's where, his unacceptance, I guess, of who I was as an individual really came from his own fear of my safety, of am I going to live? And I know that, and sorry to my sister who I'm telling on right now, I know that through conversations that she's had with him and what she's expressed, do you know what the average lifespan of someone who's gay is? Not fully understanding those statistics, but understanding that that creates fear for him. And that fear is what, again, is driving that shame, that they had then projected off. And so for me in my own journey and my process, I feel shame about a lot of different things, but this was definitely the biggest one, was growing up, one, finding the courage to just be who I am and using that courage to then live as who I am, which is very different than identifying who you are and then living that way. And finding compassion for those who had, shamed me in the past, understanding that it's more about their experience than it was about mine. Yeah. And that's how we heal trauma in general. And again, trauma and shame are so interlinked. So my journey is one of that, is going through the same process that I work with couples and individuals on of, identifying the shame, understanding it, understanding where it came from, building a safe space to exist, and then utilizing that to find compassion.
I know many beautiful moments that we've seen between couples or individuals is when they can actually say, like, I am worthy, you are worthy, you are significant, you are okay just as you are, I'm okay just as I am. Oh, freedom.
Yeah.
Freedom to be imperfect. Thank
Yes.
you. That feels really good.
Just kind of reflecting on us and our conversation today, I noticed there was this real gentleness, but also tentativeness. And I think that's there's something about that even in just discussing shame in an abstract way, for us, we were just so cautious. And I think it's because we know this is at the root of so much suffering in the world, and that it takes such, again, like what you said at the very beginning, it takes safety, and that's what we want to cultivate here for individuals, couples who are listening, is just knowing that we all carry shame, and there may be ways your partner, somebody you love, is dealing with their shame that may look sort of like you don't like it. But the remedy is not indignation and anger and frustration. It's actually opening your heart to them and letting them know, look, I want to love you and accept you completely. I don't always like things you do, and that's okay. And you're not always going to like things I do, but I think you're a good person.
Yeah, and I think even just having the intention to say, I'm going to look at you with grace and say, what is this really about? This behavior, this thing that I don't like that you're doing. What is this really about? And the other thing to remember is that there's nothing in the literature, there's nothing in the research that supports the idea that the harder we beat ourselves up and the meaner we are to ourselves, that the better we're going to be. We have to. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Surprise. But we do it. We do it all the time. We beat ourselves up. We beat each other up. And sometimes we do it in the name of accountability, but it's often not really accountability. So,
yeah, I mean, I think this is why Tara and I connected with you so quickly when we met you, is just this deep belief, this deep drive that we want to create a space for people to suffer less. Mm-hmm. And, you're doing it, and we thank you for it.
Our hearts thank you, and they're very happy that you're here with us.
Yeah,
because you can just, if anyone out there can just feel Kelby's presence, he is just, you feel like I felt safe immediately when we were even doing the interview. I was just like, oh my God, it's like this big teddy bear. That's what it felt like this safety. It was so cool. I even said that to EJ. I'm like, he's so safe, and that's, again, telling of all of the work you've done to process and heal your own shame. And
I also love, that your playfulness as well.
Yeah.
And I think that is like an essential component that, yes. An individual out there who's maybe looking for a therapist in their community is someone who creates a really safe space for you. But then that sense of play and freedom and creativity that gives you the ability then to tunnel down into some of this stuff, because it takes some work, and you have to sort of, you have to have freedom, and I think that's, you're very good at creating that space, and we appreciate you very much, Kelby.
Thank you. And, I've said it before, I wouldn't be able to show up and feel safe, feel like I could create this environment if it wasn't for you guys creating that environment in the first place for me to feel safe. So I appreciate you just as much. Thank you.
All right. Well, as always, we really appreciate all of you being on this journey with us and exploring these topics and internalizing it. We really appreciate it when you do share our show, tell a friend, tell a family member. Please give us a rating on whatever podcast platform you are listening to us on. And please leave a comment. There's a link in our show notes, and you can leave a voice comment or a text comment. We respond to every single one. Sometimes we include it, or it creates a show. This is an amazing community that we're all part of. And thank you for being a part of it.
And thank you, Kelby, for being our special guest and just a special person, and for helping others in their process of being the best people they can be, whatever that means for them. And as always, take care of yourself, take care of each other. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Me and you just singing on the train, me and you listening to the rain, me and you, we are the same, me and you have all the fame we need. Indeed, you and me are we.
The last thing you want to hear while listening to your favorite podcast is another gimmicky ad. NJM feels the same way. It's why they provide award-winning service without the use of mascots or repetitive jingles. And when you upgrade to NJM, you could even save on your auto insurance. Better service and possible savings? Sounds like a win-win. No jingles or mascots, just great insurance. NJM. Visit njm.com/podcast for a quote to see how much you could save on your auto insurance.
Need weekend plans? Check out what's happening in your local Lowe's. Weekending at Lowe's gives you and your family the opportunity to make us your weekend destination. Stop by for free workshops, events, and activities for everyone to enjoy. We're getting active with fun local events like our upcoming Lowe's Bucket Ball Challenge and Kids Workshop. Visit Lowe's.com/events for our full event lineup. Count on Lowe's for all of your home improvement needs. And now, activities in your community with Weekending at Lowe's.